10,000 years ago, in what's now northern Kenya, 27 people were killed at the edge of a lagoon. Men, women, children. Some had their hands bound before they died. Some still had arrowheads or blade fragments lodged in their bones. Archaeologists call the site Nataruk, and depending on who you ask, it might be the oldest solid evidence we have of something none of us were actually born knowing how to do. That's the part that should stop you. Not the violence itself. Humans killing humans is, unfortunately, not news. What should stop you is the word invented, because most people assume war is just baked into U.S., ancient, automatic, the default setting of any species smart enough to hold a weapon and desperate enough to need something another group has. If you'd asked most people to guess how long humans have been organizing into groups specifically to plan, coordinate, and carry out lethal violence against other groups, they'd probably say forever. As long as there have been people, there's been war. Here's the problem. The archaeological and anthropological record doesn't really back that up. And once you actually look at the evidence layer by layer, the story that emerges is genuinely stranger, and honestly more unsettling. Then humans have always been like this. Let's start with the deep timeline, because it matters enormously. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. For the overwhelming majority of that time, we lived as small, mobile, foraging bands. Groups of maybe 20 to 50 people, moving across the landscape, following food, following seasons, rarely staying in one place long enough to build anything permanent. And when researchers go looking for evidence of organized, coordinated, intergroup lethal violence, war in the specific sense of planned conflict between groups, not a fight, not a single murder, not even a raid, but sustained organized violence, that evidence is remarkably thin for most of that 300,000-year window. Isolated skeletal trauma shows up here and there. Individual killings happened, certainly, but the signature of actual warfare, mass graves, fortifications, weapons designed specifically for killing other humans rather than animals, that signature doesn't really start showing up with any consistency until much later, which raises the obvious question. If we've always had the capacity for violence, and we clearly have, why does organized war look like something that shows up relatively late in the story rather than something baked in from the beginning? And the first layer of the answer is almost embarrassingly practical. Small, mobile foraging groups genuinely didn't have much worth fighting over in the way war requires. Think about what war actually needs to make sense as a strategy. It needs a defendable resource. Land you can hold. Stored food you can seize. Something valuable enough that the risk of getting killed trying to take it is worth it. A mobile band with no permanent settlement, no stored surplus, and the freedom to just walk somewhere else when resources got tight didn't have that. If your neighbors were being difficult, the math strongly favored moving rather than fighting. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer populations, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Honsi in the Kalahari, have documented exactly this pattern. Interpersonal violence happens. Homicide happens. But organized, sustained, coordinated group warfare is genuinely rare. And when conflict does occur, the default response is usually to disperse rather than escalate. Nobody's dying to defend a patch of savanna nobody actually owns. Then agriculture happens. And this is where the story pivots hard. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in multiple locations independently, humans start settling down, growing crops, storing grain, building permanent structures. And suddenly, for the first time in the entire evolutionary history of our species, there's something worth defending in a fixed location. A granary can be raided. A field can be seized. A well-positioned settlement with stored food becomes, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, an enormously valuable and enormously vulnerable target. This is the same window of time where the archaeological signature of organized violence starts becoming genuinely unambiguous. Fortified settlements. Mass graves with dozens of victims killed in a single coordinated event. Weapons that show clear specialization for fighting other humans rather than hunting animals. The transition to agriculture didn't just change what we ate. It manufactured, for the first time, the specific economic conditions that make organized warfare a rational strategy rather than a pointless risk. But resources alone don't explain everything. Because resources alone don't organize 20 people into a coordinated raiding party with a plan. That requires something else. It requires social technology. Here's the second layer, and it's the one that gets less attention than it deserves. Organizing a group of humans to commit coordinated violence against another group requires leadership, division of labor, shared symbols of group identity, and language sophisticated enough to plan something that hasn't happened yet. You need someone people will follow. You need agreement on who counts as us and who counts as them, which sounds simple but is actually a genuinely complex cognitive and social achievement. You need the ability to coordinate timing, roles, and strategy among people who might not even be related to each other. None of that existed in small mobile foraging bands. Not because those people were incapable of it cognitively, they had the same brains we have, but because the social structures that make coordinated action at scale possible, hierarchy, specialization, large stable group identity, simply hadn't been built yet. Sedentism and agriculture didn't just create something worth fighting over. They created larger, denser, more socially stratified populations. And it's exactly that social complexity, leaders, symbols, hierarchy, group identity that provided the organizational scaffolding war actually requires. Now, here's where we have to be honest. Because this conversation gets contentious in academic circles, and pretending otherwise would be irresponsible, not everyone agrees with the picture I just laid out. There's a well-known counter-argument associated with researchers like Richard Wrangham, built partly on observations of chimpanzee behavior. Chimpanzee communities, our closest living relatives, have been documented engaging in something that looks disturbingly like organized intergroup violence. Coordinated patrols along territorial boundaries. Targeted, sometimes lethal attacks on individuals from neighboring communities. If our nearest evolutionary cousins show something resembling proto-warfare, the argument goes, maybe the capacity, and even the practice, goes back much further than the agricultural transition. And the archaeological gap is simply a gap in preservation and discovery rather than a gap in behavior. Skeletons decompose. Evidence from tens of thousands of years ago is genuinely hard to find. And absence of evidence isn't automatically evidence of absence, on the other side. Researchers like Douglas Fry have pushed back hard, arguing that comparing chimpanzee intergroup aggression to human warfare overstates the similarity and understates just how much organization, planning, and social infrastructure actual human warfare requires. A handful of chimpanzees ambushing a lone rival is a genuinely different phenomenon from dozens of humans coordinating a raid with weapons, strategy, and defined roles. The honest answer, the one that respects both sides, is probably that the underlying psychological ingredients in group loyalty, out-group suspicion, coalition-based aggression, are old, genuinely old, possibly older than our species. But the specific behavior we call war, organized, sustained, planned lethal conflict between structured groups, required those ancient psychological ingredients to be combined with a set of social and economic conditions that simply didn't exist until relatively recently. The raw material was ancient, the invention was not, and that distinction matters enormously, because it reframes the entire question. War isn't some primal force we've been failing to outgrow for 300,000 years. It's closer to a technology. A specific combination of psychology, economics, and social organization that had to be assembled, piece by piece, before it became possible. Fire needed fuel and a spark. War needed surplus, territory, hierarchy, and group identity. Once those pieces existed, war became available to us the way agriculture became available, the way writing became available, the way every major human invention became available the moment the right preconditions lined up. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. If war is a technology rather than an instinct, that means it can, in principle, be uninvented, or at least redesigned. The same way any other technology can be revised, replaced, or abandoned once the conditions that produced it change. It also means every society that has ever gone to war wasn't simply expressing some unavoidable feature of human nature. It was responding to a specific set of pressures. Resource scarcity, territorial competition, in-group identity threat, that once didn't exist, then did, and could in theory not exist again under different conditions. That's a very different story than the one most of us grew up believing. Go back to that lagoon in northern Kenya. 27 people, killed at the edge of the water, roughly 10,000 years ago. Right around the window when settlement, surplus, and group identity were all beginning to lock into place for the first time in human history. Whether Nataruk represents the literal first war or simply one of the earliest we happen to find, it sits almost exactly where the evidence says it should. Not at the dawn of our species. At the dawn of the specific conditions that made organized violence between groups make sense for the first time. You carry the same raw ingredients those people did. The same coalition instincts. The same capacity to draw a line between us and them. What you don't automatically carry is the specific set of conditions that turns those ingredients into war. That part was built. Which means, at least in theory, it can be unbuilt too.